Okay. So, Tony, how are you doing?
Fine, thank you, Frank. I'm Tony Hansen. I came to the U.S. as a graduate student in 1972. I loved it in Berkeley. I've been here ever since. It's my great pleasure to welcome essentially the next generation, Frenk and Ida Krischel-Ovari, and to see their view of this world through their eyes as new as if it was me seeing it all 50 years ago.
Right. So, like you said, me and Ida came here for, just for 3 months, a short period of time, for a research exchange. But you came here, what year?
I came here in 1972, and when I did so, I had absolutely no idea of what I was getting into, because in those days, we didn't have internet, we didn't have much news, and if I looked at a globe of the world with England in the center, which of course was the norm for people in Britain in those days, California was off the edge. You couldn't even see it. And so we had no conception at all. We had no idea of the social revolution, the free speech movement, the Vietnam War protests, the civil rights movement, the summer of love, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Now, all of this was completely unknown to me. I was a naive youth who got on an airplane and thought to myself, jolly good, I'm going to do this for 4 years and then I'll do something else. When I got here, within no more than a few minutes, I realized that I had been dropped into a washing machine on the spin cycle. It was astonishing. The variety, the energy, the free-spiritedness of the people was a complete contrast to the rather stuffy England that I had come out of. Now, me, being a very entrepreneurial sort of a fellow, found myself immediately at home. I could do all kinds of crazy things, and rather than criticizing me and saying, why on earth would you do that for someone of your background and education, people said to me, wow, that's amazing. I didn't know you could do that. So it was a complete change. After 5 years, when I got my PhD,
what did you study?
I studied physics on the Berkeley campus. I realized that I really wanted to stay here no matter what. I did not want to go back to England because Mrs. Thatcher had only recently detonated the economy. It was still the remnants of the old school system, etc., etc. There were no opportunities for someone like me. Whereas here, the world was wide open.
So your undergrad you did at Oxford?
I did my undergraduate at Merton College in Oxford, which was a bastion of wealth and privilege. And indeed, to my face, I was denounced as a grammar school grubby because I was not just a lower class person, because I was not of the aristocracy. And in those days, the college was men only, and it was still making the transition from the world of aristocracy and privilege and family connection into what is now very much differently a meritocracy. Merton College has admitted female students for the last 40 years, so everything has become much more civilized, and it's one of the best academic colleges in the University of Oxford. But at the time when I was there, it was still just a remnant of the old school system. But I didn't care, because entirely by chance, just before, in the vacations before my final year, I was studying to try and prepare myself for the final exams. I was in the local regional library near where I lived. I turned over a magazine and there was a little tiny ad that said, why not go to America as a graduate student? And I thought, gosh, that's a good idea. So I cut out that ad, or wrote down the details, because we didn't have cameras then. And when I went back to college in September, I said to my tutor, I saw an advertisement that said that I could go to America. And he said, really? I didn't know that was possible. Nobody knew that it was possible. But by following up on it, doing the interviews, going to London, so on, I was provisionally accepted at a number of the best US universities by January or February of my final year. All of my classmates were sweating because their future would depend entirely on the final exams that they would have to take in May and June. They didn't know what would happen, and if they screwed up on their exams, they wouldn't go anywhere. Me, I already had it in the bag. So then I went back to my tutor and I said to him, look, I've received provisional offers from all of these places. What do we do? Good heavens, he says, I don't know. He says, let's take a look. Rice University. Where's that? Texas. Dreadful place. Don't go there. So that one was deleted. Illinois, Chicago. Isn't that where all the gangsters are from? Don't go there. And finally he says, Berkeley. I've heard good things about Berkeley. Why don't you go there? And that was the sum total of my learned academic advice that determined the entire rest of my year. Entirely by chance, I had seen this little newspaper ad that said, why not go to America? And then my professor had said, Berkeley, why don't you go to Berkeley? I've heard good things about it. That was it. So I got on an airplane, and this was before the deregulation of airplane fares. So I got on a 747, a westbound 747, as the song goes. There was only maybe 1/4 full. So I had a whole row of seats to myself. And I came on and I looked out of the windows and I didn't have a clue where I was going. And I got to Berkeley and there were wild-eyed people with frizzy hair and tie-dyed t-shirts, and there were signs that said, fuck the police, and all kinds of things that I had no clue about whatsoever. But then as I walked up the steps of International House, which was going to be my residence hall for the next 1 or 2 years, I had a realization. I was christened with 3 first names, which is fairly common in England: Anthony, David, Anders, Hansen. And I realized as I walked up the steps that not a single person in the US knew me at all. And all of a sudden, I could decide to be Tony, Dave, or Andy. I thought to myself, who am I going to be? This is a great opportunity. Well, I stuck with Tony just because I was used to it, but it was an example of the kind of instantaneous opportunity that no one had prepared me for and I had not thought about at all. So for the rest of my life, I could have been Dave or Andy, and nobody would know the origin of that whatsoever.
I've noticed something similar. So when moving to an entirely new place, you can turn a new leaf and you can
be
not just pick a name.
You can be a whole new person.
I think you can be more yourself than sometimes before, no?
Well, in those days, there was no social media, no LinkedIn, no electronic records. Nowadays, if you have a LinkedIn profile, and especially if you're a woman and you get married, while you may take your husband's name for civil reasons, you may retain your original name for professional reasons, because that's how you're known. You have a profile on LinkedIn. You have a track record of publications and presentations. But back in the day, and especially with me being an undergraduate or graduate, I could have been anyone that I wanted. But by the same token, I found that I was dropped into a mix of Americans and other international students. There were a few other Brits there who I associated with, but for the most part, the Americans were just overwhelmingly naive about the implications of a British accent. They assumed that if you had a British accent, and I had a better accent then than I do now, that you must necessarily be educated, urbane, second cousin to James Bond, all of this kind of stuff. And so there was this sort of baggage, only it wasn't really negative baggage, it was a positive expectation that people thought all kinds of things about me that really weren't true at all. And then, of course, when I inadvertently would release that, yes, I had been educated at Oxford University, well, I was second cousin to the Queen.
All right, so you came from England and you got into Berkeley. What kind of work did you get up to so as a graduate student and then later in the Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory?
I had always been a gadget kid. Some people, they say, are born with a silver spoon in their mouth, the aristocracy. Some people are born with musical abilities. I had a friend as an undergraduate who was just an absolute natural master genius at music. I was born as a genius with a screwdriver or a soldering iron. So getting into physics was the natural course for me to do gadgetry. I had been a radio amateur when I was a kid. I had bought, repaired, and sold motorcycles and scooters and cars. And when I was an undergraduate, I ingratiated myself to all of the domestic staff by fixing their vacuum cleaners and radios and everything else. So I wanted to do something practical, so I got into experimental low-temperature physics, which required a whole lot of gadgetry, knowledge of how things worked, and so on. When I finished my PhD, I really wanted to stay in Berkeley, and again, entirely by chance, one of the professors for whom I had been a teaching assistant just happened to have had lunch at the Lawrence Berkeley Lab cafeteria with someone he knew dimly who said, "Oh, I'm starting a research group on atmospheric pollution. Do you know any smart students?" Bingo, that was me. So I did my homework, tried to read a little bit about air pollution particles, and I tried to think of how the things that I knew how to do could help them. So I was prepared for the interview, and when I turned up, I listened to him explain his work, and then he essentially said to me, "So what can you do for us?" Well, I already had a list of what I thought I could do for them. So that was my job interview, and I started that in 1977. What we were doing was to study the particles which would make a gray or black deposit on a white filter. If you put a white handkerchief over the entrance to a vacuum cleaner nozzle and suck polluted air through it, after a while you make a gray or a black spot. Well, what is that gray or black stuff? It's probably important. You can certainly see it, but at the time nobody really knew what it was. They had heard of soot in terms of smoke from coal smoke, from steam engines, from trains, things like that. But that had largely disappeared because those steam trains had been replaced by diesel trains and so on. Nobody really thought about soot. They thought of it as very old-fashioned. They thought of the Industrial Revolution in England. They thought of the sinking of the Titanic, stuff like that. But they didn't really think that this black stuff in the air could be related to it. So nobody really knew what it was, and the focus of this group was to identify it chemically and physically, and then to figure out ways of measuring it. So together with about half a dozen other people who were chemists, analytical people, and so on, my job was to do the physics part of it, which was to say, what could it be that is black and is long-lived and doesn't dissolve, and so on and so on. We identified it as a form of microcrystalline graphite, just little rings of carbon atoms. That's why it's black. And that's why it's stable, and that's why it doesn't disappear in the air, and that's why when it falls on the snow and the ice, it remains black, and it helps the snow and the ice to melt quicker. So we identified it, and then in 1979, I had a realization. I was looking at one of these filters through which we were sucking air, and I realized that if the air was really polluted, that filter would go from white to gray to black rather quickly.
And that brings us to
the invention.
Entrepreneurship story, right?
But if the air was really clean, the filter would go from white to very light gray, very slightly darker gray, very, very slowly. And if I shone a light through that filter at the same time, then the intensity of light would gradually reduce proportional to the accumulation of black stuff on the top. So by shining a light while at the same time sucking the air, I could measure the rate at which that spot became black, which was directly proportional to the concentration of black stuff. Bingo. That was the invention of the instrument. And then I was talking to a colleague who said, well, you got to give it a good name. They said, no one will accept some sort of cheesy name. My supervisor was of Jewish extraction from New York, and he wanted to call it the Schwartz meter. I said, no one's going to believe it if we call it the Schwartz meter. But because I had had an education in the classics, I discovered that in the classical Greek theater from 2,500 years ago, the characters who represented the positive side of things wore white robes and had their faces whitened with chalk. These were the good guys in classical Greek theater. The bad guys who represented the destructive fates or bad things that were going to happen wore black robes and had their faces blackened with soot. And we'll flash forward and just remember that in the earliest Western movies, the good guys, the good cowboys always wore white hats and the bad cowboys always wore black hats. And even today, we have the concept of the black hat hacker. Anyway, so the ancient Greeks would blacken their faces with soot, and there was a verb for this because the word eth meant soot in classical Greek, and ethaloon meant to blacken with soot, to sootify. And so an aethalometer was an instrument that measured the blackening by soot. Bingo! There was the name of my instrument, and I made a very crude prototype, and it worked, and I sent the first hand-drawn chart of real-time measurements of the amount of black stuff in the air in an urban environment back from a field project to my group and my boss in 1979 or 1980. And that hand-drawn chart is still on display at our company in Slovenia, and I'll get to that in a minute.
I have to say, you made a good call with calling it an aethalometer.
Yeah.
It sounds very scientific.
Of course it does. Much better than a Schwartz meter. And then in the books, his Dark Materials, they had an Aethalometer, which was an instrument that divined the truth. Mm-hmm. But it's a similar Greek word, but not the same. So people wondered whether my instrument also divined the truth, just like in his Dark Materials. I said, no, it measures the amount of black stuff.
So all of this climate science and pollution detection, how was that back in the 70s and the 80s compared to now?
Nobody wanted to think about it at all, because in those days, all of the effort in air pollution was focused on acid rain, which was due to the sulfur that was coming out of smokestacks, and classical ozone smog, which was really, really dreadful in places like Los Angeles, which was due to the effect of the ultraviolet component of sunshine acting on the unburned parts of fuel that were blown out of the tailpipes of cars at that time. So in LA, in the 70s and 80s, you didn't know there were mountains. Sometimes the smog was so bad that visibility was only a couple of kilometers. And the ozone would sting your eyes, it would degrade rubber bands, it was just awful. And that was where all of the focus of air pollution research was. It was either photochemical smog and ozone from automobile exhaust, or it was acid rain from factories. And when I, as a young man, showed one of my filters with a gray spot to the leading scientist of the day, he said, well, that's not important. He says, what do you think it is? I said, well, we think it's carbon soot. And he looked at me and he says, there is none of that in the modern atmosphere. It doesn't exist. It's not important. You're wasting your time. Go home. Well, I didn't.
Okay, so going back to your invention, what happened next?
What happened next was that nobody was really interested in this in the urban environment. Nobody thought it was important. But it had been noticed by airplane pilots flying in to the north coast of Alaska to bring supplies and people for the oil pipeline, that in the springtime, if you looked out of the windows of a plane in the Arctic, it looked like a chocolate cake. There were layers of black and brown across the sky, and this was called the Arctic haze. And it had been seen out of the windows of planes, but no one had really thought about it. But then a colleague of mine at the NOAA, Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in Boulder, Colorado, decided that this was worth studying. So he put together a proposal to fly an instrumented research airplane in the Arctic, loaded up with a whole bunch of different scientific instruments to try and measure this stuff and see what was in this black stuff, because it was very, very obvious and visible, even though you were thousands of miles away from wherever you thought it might be coming from. So we went up to Anchorage, Alaska, installed our equipment in the plane, and in the early 1980s, we flew the first flights up to the Arctic and then above the north coast of Alaska towards the North Pole. And sure enough, when you looked out of the windows, there were black lines across the sky, and my very primitive instrument, along with many of the other instruments, showed huge increases as the plane gradually descended through these layers. It turned out that this black stuff was coming from the smoke-belching industries of Siberia, Norilsk, where there's a huge nickel refinery, Murmansk, where there's a tremendous amount of industry. They were burning coal, blowing out great clouds of black smoke, and it was just going round and round the Arctic. As a by-note, I'll say that in those days, in the early 80s, the Arctic was frozen from side to side. Now it's half melted. So
was that the first of your
that was
trips?
So the first application of my measurement was geophysical, to essentially trace the movement of this inert stuff from its source, which would be in industry in the lower latitudes, up to the most remote places. If you could find black stuff in the air in the Arctic, it had to have come from somewhere. How did it get there? What was the transport in the atmosphere? So in the 1980s, we flew, actually that operation flew 4 sets of missions. So I flew over the North Pole several times. And the North Pole, of course, is just ice floating on water. Now, the air crew were getting paid for flying the plane, but if they would fly under very dangerous conditions, they would get double pay. So every time we had a flight, in order to put their flight into the category of highly dangerous, they would fly at no more than, let's say, 10 to 20 meters above the surface of the frozen ocean. So everybody had to strap in, nobody had to move, the balance was absolutely critical, and we went roaring across the broken, jagged ice that was just right below us outside the windows, and we had to do that for 15 minutes in order for the flight crew to claim their hazardous duty bonus. It was terrifying because one mistake and boom, there's just pieces everywhere and that's it, you're done. So that was the North Pole in the 80s, and then the measurement of black stuff was essentially geophysical from the perspective of, if you're very far away, how did it get here? In the 90s, somebody realized that school buses that take children from their homes to the schools in the US were old diesel buses with leaky windows, and that the children were essentially being gassed and fumigated on their way to school and back again.
Oh, wow.
This wasn't quite as bad as the gas chambers in Auschwitz, but nevertheless, because children's lungs are delicate and are still developing, the potential for a health impact was substantial. And so they started making measurements. I made a small version of my instrument, and they took it on school buses, and sure enough, the fumes, the diesel fumes, were getting sucked in through the windows as the bus went along. when the bus stopped and was idling, all of that smoke would get into the bus, and that turned into essentially the first realization of the adverse health impact of diesel smoke, diesel fumes, and air pollution in that regard. So that was in the 1990s. But something had happened prior to that.
Yes, so you went to a country we're both familiar with in the 80s, right?
Well, that is correct. In 1980, when I was working at that research group at the Lawrence Lab, my boss was of Serbian extraction. And he thought highly of himself, and he was a very smart guy, but anyway, there was only one person in the world whom he respected who was even more arrogant and even more self-important, and that was a big professor in Vienna. Now, the big professor in Vienna was being bugged by a very annoying person from Yugoslavia. And this annoying person from Yugoslavia wanted the Viennese professor to send a student or someone to Ljubljana to help them set up a program to study environmental chemistry. So my boss had the bright idea that if he sent young Tony Hansen, that he would then get favors from this big guy in Vienna. And so I was sent to Yugoslavia in exchange for tickets to the Vienna Opera. I was essentially traded. So I came home from the office and said to my wife, we'd only just gotten married, I said, my boss wants us to go to Yugoslavia. Great, she says, when do we go? No, where, what, why, what on earth, where's that, what is all that about?
Did you know where Yugoslavia was at that point?
Dimly, very, very dimly, but not really at all. But that was how things were in those days. If an opportunity presented itself, boom, you did it. So we went to Yugoslavia, and in those days, so that was 1980, 81, the economy was pretty stagnant. It wasn't as repressive as places behind the barbed wire of the Soviet Union. I had done several visits with the NOAA people to the Soviet Union in the middle 1980s. That was very, very repressive and very weird and different. So Yugoslavia was sort of halfway in between. But we immediately fell in love with the country and the people. It was beautiful. The people were friendly. The people with whom we worked at the Institute of Chemistry, then that young scientist came to Berkeley when he was here with his wife. My wife and we became good friends. We helped them. We went back and forth. We developed connections to Slovenia in the 1980s.
Did you notice so you've been coming to Slovenia since the 80s.
Yes.
Have you noticed any differences, and let's maybe stay in the 80s, the 90s? What kind of changes happened in those days?
Huge changes. So when we first went there, the town of Jesenice and that whole valley, the Upper Sava Valley, was under a complete cloud of acrid yellow smoke from the steel industry. It was dreadful. The city of Ljubljana was under a complete cloud of coal smoke. The coal, which they dug out of the ground in Velenje, if it was any good, they would sell it for export. And only the very worst coal that they couldn't possibly sell for export was available to the population. And my colleague Mirko Biziak lived in an old, creaky, dusty, drafty apartment near the center of town. He would carry up 4 tons of soft coal every winter and put them into stoves in each of the rooms of his apartment to stay warm. And all of that coal burned and produced acrid, sulfurous smoke, and the sulfurous smoke hung over the air just like it did in London when I was a tiny kid. So the atmosphere of Ljubljana in 1980 was a replica of the classical London air pollution of Dickens's time. And that was why we went. Also, all of the traffic went right through the center of town. All of the heavy trucks, all of the buses, everything went over the 3 bridges and through the old city, down, those little tiny medieval roads, through the tunnels and so on.
So now it's a bit more pleasant these
Oh,
days.
yeah. All of the buildings were grey and peeling. All of the beautiful buildings that had been built under the Habsburgs, nothing had been maintained or preserved or looked after. Everything just looked depressing. It didn't look as depressing as the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union had never had the benefit of the Habsburgs. But nevertheless, it was a very... But despite all of that, we loved the people, the countryside. They were so friendly. Everything was beautiful. Another thing that we noticed was the government had relaxed the regulations on allowing people to build houses if they owned property in the countryside or if their family did. So every weekend, the countryside was full of these little Fiat 600, the feature, pulling a trailer loaded with cement blocks. Everywhere you looked in the countryside, there were men standing around cement mixers, women making lunch, people drinking schnapps and smoking cigarettes and building houses. I think now that has gradually subsided, but it was quite something different. Also, working hours were from 6 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon. So I would get up at the crack of dawn, walk to the Chemistry Institute. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, everybody went home. They all went out in the countryside to put another 2 bricks into their house. By early evening, Ljubljana was completely closed. There were no lights on at all. The only lights that were on was the top floor of the Nebatichnik, where the restaurant was open to Communist Party members, people of privilege. Normal people couldn't go up there.
Yeah. But like you mentioned with the houses, yeah, that's why almost, well, not everyone, but a lot of people still have these houses, very big houses.
Oh, yeah.
But they were like regular people working in a brewery or maybe as a secretary.
Yep, absolutely. And they all had to burn coal to stay warm. Gradually, they brought in the central hot water, which was a huge advantage. So now all of those old buildings in the center of town, there's pipes that run down the middle of the street with hot water, and then it goes through radiators, and so you don't have to do that anymore. But yeah, it was clearly a more egalitarian society with a very, very thin crust of people of privilege in the political stratum.
And before we head back to your invention and slowly moving towards your company, you said you were also in the year 1990 in Slovenia, right?
Yes. In 1990, we adopted our son at birth, so I had a brand new infant. And in March of 1991, we had been at a conference in Austria, and then we went to Ljubljana to see our friends with a little tiny kid in a stroller. And it was clear, very clear, that something was going to happen politically. Nobody knew what was going to happen or when it was going to happen, but the center of Ljubljana was full of students at little tables handing out leaflets. There were placards on the walls. People were putting a Lipa leaf sticker over the red star in the middle of the license plate of the car numbers. The soldiers of the JNA were just all standing around listlessly smoking cigarettes. Nobody knew what was going to happen, but they knew that something was going to happen. And of course, no more than a few months later, you declared independence, and you guys were lucky it was all over in a few days. But it was very, very clear, you could just sense the electricity in the air, but you could also sense the fact that nobody really knew what was going to happen or whether it was going to be really, really bad or whether it was going to be quick. You guys were lucky because Slovenia was ethnically homogeneous. Further south, people were much less lucky because of the ethnic mixing.
Yeah.
And a few years later, we, in about 92 or 93, we were sitting in the apartment of our friends in the center of Ljubljana, just next to the TV center. And we were looking at TV, and there was something very boring. And so Mirko says, let's look at HTV. He says, their programs are better. So he goes clickety-click on his TV, and here's some musical program on HTV. And he says, see, this is more fun. Along the bottom of the screen were words running. We call them a chyron here in the US. usually the words would be soccer scores. It would say Karlovac 2, Novi Sad 3, something like that. But instead it was just the list of names, Karlovac. I said to him, Mirko, there are no scores associated with that. What do these names mean? Oh, he said, those are cities that are under bombardment by the Serbs. I said, but that just said Karlovac. That's only 100 clicks from here. Oh, he says, that's their business. We're done. So it was really pretty amazing to be sitting in Ljubljana and to see Croatian TV announcing that the city of Karlovac was under bombardment, and to realize that was only 100 kilometers from where we were.
That's insane.
It would be as if I was sitting here in Berkeley and that there was a huge war between the Spanish-speaking population of California and the English-speaking population, and the TV would show me that the city of San Jose was under bombardment.
Yeah,
It was just completely surreal.
Wow. Okay, so coming back to the US.
Yeah.
You invented this machine,
Yeah.
the Aethalometer, right?
Yes.
And what happened next? You mentioned something about a shed that's right here.
That is correct. I had invented the aethalometer in about 1979 and started publishing papers which were simply descriptive measurements of black stuff in remote places. And the emphasis essentially was, here's the data, how did this stuff get here? At a conference in about 1986, a Canadian scientist came up to me and said, I really want one of these machines. Can you make one for me? And I said, well, we're a national laboratory. We're associated with the university. We don't make stuff for other people. And he says, well, then, he says, you should go home to your garage and make one for me privately. He says, otherwise, I'll get my technician to figure out how it works and we'll just copy the concept. Well, I wasn't going to let that happen. In those days, the university did not seek patents for any of its inventions, and in fact, they actively released it to the public free of charge. So I was legally able to come home and start work in my garden shed and make one. And of course, I knew exactly how to do this because I had been doing it up at the lab during the day anyway. I found local places that could do machining and sheet metal. I knew how to do soldering and wires. It was just an extension from being a radio amateur of 10 or 20 years earlier. So I made my very first aethalometer in the garden shed that's right over there behind us in 1986, put it in a box, sent it to Canada, and they sent me a check. I was in business. This was fantastic. I had no overhead, no obligations, no fixed costs. If I simply worked second to my regular job, then here it was. And it was not just the business and the money. I was really promoting a technology, promoting the science, getting the word out. It was evangelism. And so I started a business, and I realized that this was going to be pretty absorbing and that it would compete with my attention to my wife and family. Her family name was Magee, and several generations earlier, her distant ancestors had factories that made the huge cast iron cooking stoves that went out to the prairies with the settlers all across America. Those giant black stoves that you would put coal or wood in the bottom and then bake your pies. So 3 generations ago, they had been in the business of making smoke. So it was logical that to also, as a credit to her and to deflect any criticism I was spending too much time on the business, I called it Magee Scientific.
And that's still the name of the company.
Still the name of the company. And so we were now in the business of measuring smoke, whereas 2 or 3 generations earlier, they had been in the business of making smoke. So I formed the company in my garden shed in 1986 and started making the equipment by hand. And in my busiest year, I made 24 instruments, which was a lot of sitting out here in the evening, working at night, because I had a regular job, obviously. I had to do this outside of those hours. But the word was getting out. More and more people were believing that black carbon particles were real, that they were a tracer for the movement of the atmosphere, and that they might have implications and characteristics themselves. In other words, the black stuff might be bad for your health, and if the black stuff settles down on formerly white ice and snow, when the sun shines on it, it might melt quicker. And if there's black stuff in the air, then when the sun shines on it, the air's going to warm up. In other words, climate change.
Was there a big consciousness about climate change in those days?
No, not at all. Not until the 2000s. That was the decade when climate change came in.
Mm-hmm. And with Al Gore and
with Al Gore and the polar bear on the tiny ice floe and so on. Mm-hmm. So the 80s were characterized by geophysics. How does the black stuff circulate the globe? The 90s were the health effects of diesel exhaust on children. The 2000s were climate change. By 1996, I was getting overwhelmed in my shed because the demand was increasing. I happened to be in Slovenia, and my colleague Mirko says, well, he says, we're now 5 years into our independence, things have settled down, we're open for business, we're smart, we're less expensive than Germany. Why don't you see if you could find a company to make your equipment here?
Was that at that point the demand getting so much that you couldn't?
It was too much for me here, yeah. So I took one of my homemade instruments, and I was introduced to a technical committee and gave a presentation at Iskra, which was probably the largest Slovenian technology business at the time, but it was gradually dismantling itself because it had previously supported itself on military contracts and so on. So it was downsizing. Well, the management of Iskra wasn't interested at all. They thought this was primitive and stupid and there wasn't enough market potential. So that didn't go anywhere, but as we were leaving, two men came up to my colleague Mirko and said, could we have a cup of coffee? So we met them for a cup of coffee. Afterwards, they were in the process of figuring out how to leave Iskra and form their own business. I was their first contract. They were smart. They knew how to do this. They had previously made laser rangefinders for the Yugoslav military. So my thing was very simplistic in comparison, which meant that they could redesign it much better. And so that company was called Optotec. They now have about 100 employees, and they make primarily equipment for ophthalmic treatment using lasers to do treatments inside your eyes. But at the time, there were two of them, and then they hired someone. They hired a very young man to be their technician, and they made my equipment under contract for about 10 years.
Okay. And moving along.
10 years later, I realized that we really needed the control and the independence because they had got to the point where they were being sought out for acquisition by other companies elsewhere in Europe, and their business in ophthalmological instruments would take first place and I would just get thrown away.
And at that point you were still licensing out your
yeah.
Do you have any patents on the technology? Or
not really. Not that any that are really enforceable. Mm-hmm. But then in 2007, we formed our own business, Aerosol, DOO. The managers of Optotec, astonishingly and stupidly, tried to say to me, well, if we lose your business, then we don't need these employees. You know, what you're doing will cause these people to lose their jobs. Well, bingo! They were the people who had been making my instrument. So they were essentially I just went to each of those people independently, said, can we have a cup of coffee? And offered them a job starting April 1. So when we opened our doors as an independent company, we had 5 or 6 people who had been making my instrument for the last several years at Optotec.
How many people was that in 2007?
About 7 people, and now we have 35.
Nice.
So it was a seamless transition. We started with our own business. We started in a very small office. We gradually moved. But the product continued with its continuity and the most important thing for most scientists is to be sure that the data is going to be continuous, reproducible, reliable. And now I'll segue into a little example of why this is important. I'm an old guy. I go to the doctor. The doctor may take a couple of measurements on me of things that are invisible. The doctor may look at the numbers and the doctor may say to me, "You got to improve your lifestyle because these numbers need to come down, otherwise you're in trouble." I go back 6 months later, the doctor takes the same 2 measurements that are invisible and says to me, "You're doing the right thing." And those measurements could be blood pressure and cholesterol. These are things that are completely invisible and imperceptible to the normal person, but these are numbers that if they're too big, you're in trouble. Now, the only way you know that you're doing the right thing is if you have an accurate, reliable, reproducible way of measuring it. If a blood pressure gauge was completely random, you wouldn't know whether you had a problem and you wouldn't know if you were doing the right thing. So the important thing for any scientific instrument is that it has to be reliable and reproducible. And that has been a hallmark for a long time.
Opening a company in Slovenia in 2007, how would you compare that experience or the whole ecosystem? Like, we've had a lot of conversations about this privately, but yeah, are there some comparisons you could speak of in the US?
Yeah. Firstly, when we went to open a business in Slovenia, we found at the time the authorities were very open to help. Essentially, I called somebody and they made a couple of phone calls and they said, "We have an appointment with the Minister of Science and Technology." So we went to an office building, went upstairs. There was a secretary sitting at a desk and she says, "Oh yes, the minister will see you." We went into this person's office and he said, "I'm the Minister of Science and Technology. How can we help you?" That was pretty amazing because it's a small country. But what we did find, and this is a distinction to the US, is that the amount of bureaucracy is prodigiously greater, probably 3 times greater. So now that we have a running business, we probably have 2 or 3 people whose job is purely to deal with bureaucracy that would not be required here in the US. Everything is counted. I'm not going to assert that every sheet of toilet paper is counted, but it almost sometimes feels like that. I think the intentions are good. Certainly the social benefits are good, but this does place a large overhead on the running of a business, and an American who didn't expect that would be quite surprised.
Mm-hmm.
So
you also mentioned the finances are public, right?
Finances are public. So on IPES, you can essentially read the balance sheet and the profit and loss of every business. Whereas in the US, businesses' financial performance, unless you're publicly traded, but for a privately held business, that's as confidential as your sex life. It would be astonishing to be able to see what somebody else's business performance was. Tax records are completely confidential. And interestingly enough, at one point I met the US ambassador to Slovenia, and he didn't realize that. He had no idea.
The US ambassador?
The US ambassador did not realize that business records are public. Here's another example. Everyone in the company gets an allowance for lunch. They get a certain number of euros every day for lunch. But if visitors come to the company and the company takes the visitors out to lunch, and if some of the employees accompany those visitors to lunch, and if the company buys for lunch, then they don't get their lunch allowance because they've already had their lunch bought for them because they went out with the visitors.
Oh, because it's a business expense.
Yeah, exactly. And there was endless, gnashing of teeth and trying to figure out how to get around this. I just gave them one of my credit cards and said, look, whenever you have visitors, use this card. It's, one of mine. It's linked to my business. I'll just write it down as a marketing expense. Because otherwise, if some representatives, say from Germany, came to visit the company and they all took them out to lunch and 2 of our staff members went together with them, then our administrator would have to carefully deduct their lunch allowance for that day and document it. And
so it's a lot of work for...
Just a lot of work for not very much. So the concept of drobizh doesn't seem to exist in business.
And you mentioned also, like here in the US, they have the take a penny, leave a penny system.
Yeah,
right?
exactly, yeah. Tips, when I'm now lucky enough to have a place up in the mountains, there's a Gostilna nearby, and the proprietor of the Gostilna says that if you give him a tip officially, then he has to account for it, allocate it, he has to divide it amongst the staff. Each of those people then has to possibly pay tax on it, and he says the amount of bureaucracy is not worth the effort. If, on the other hand, you just put €5 on the table, he's happy. But if you add €5 to a credit card, then it's more than €5 worth of work for him to deal with it. So while the bureaucracy is well-intentioned and strives very hard to avoid corruption and so on, it places a disproportionate burden on the administration of things that is out of proportion to the benefit received. In terms of other bureaucracy, so that would really be my main difference is, firstly, the fact that business records are public. Secondly, that there's a lot more bureaucracy, and if you want to think of it, sort of the counting of sheets of toilet paper, almost, but not quite.
Sure. Are there any differences in culture or like?
Oh yes,
people?
Yeah. Our company is very successful. The people are dedicated. They're doing a great job, but they all go home at 4 o'clock. Almost none of them will work extra time, even if there's a need for it or if there's something interesting going on. And part of this stems from the labor protection. Here in the US, it varies from state to state, but in most places, you can lose your job in an instant. If the business is experiencing a downturn in business, a reduction in revenue, then your boss can say to you, you're a great guy, but Friday is your last day. Boom, you're gone.
Here tomorrow, gone.
Yes, yeah. And so because of that, people will strive to work harder so that if somebody has to be terminated, it's not going to be them. This is deleterious in that it leads people to work too hard. It leads to a distortion of the work-life balance because you have this constant sort of Byzantine uncertainty hanging over you.
I've noticed that, work culture in the US is...
Yeah.
Work-life balance is more just like work balance.
Yeah.
And vacation days are pretty short. I think there's... In Slovenia, it's what's like 25?
Lots of vacation days.
Yeah,
so
in the
now,
US,
when I was working my own business, building equipment by myself in my shed, I didn't have any employees. I knew that there was an absolutely direct one-to-one correlation between how hard I worked and what my reward would be, whether that reward would be financial or psychological or scientific. If I was in Slovenia, if I was an SP running a Gostilna or a coffee shop, if I don't serve cups of coffee to people, promptly and friendly, then they're not going to come to my coffee shop. My business is going to fail. But if you're the employee of a large business, then you have to really screw up in a very distinct way that essentially represents a transgression of the law in order to be terminated. And so when we hire somebody, they have a 6-month probation, but once they pass the 6-month probation, they are essentially employees for life unless something goes really, really wrong and they do something that is contrary to their employment contract. If our business turns down a little bit, we can't just look at everyone and say, well, you know, you're a really good person, but Friday is your last day. We can't do that.
Mm-hmm. But I suppose some of these are, you know, there's two sides of every coin.
Oh, yes, of course, yeah. Because people have more security, they can be more relaxed about what they do. They don't feel this invisible pressure. On the other side, maybe they're not quite as creative because they don't need to be creative. It's you know, there are pluses and minuses of socialism.
Yeah.
Here in the US, there's no socialism at all. You either succeed by stepping on everybody else's face, or you fail, and there's always a sheet of cardboard that you can sleep on under the freeway.
Yeah, it's extreme like that.
It is extreme, and I think that when one looks at the satisfaction of people in some European countries, there are many countries that I think would be models for Americans to realize is a better quality of life. I'm thinking of Denmark, the Netherlands. I'd say Slovenia, but I don't know Slovenia well enough to know whether people are really happy or how it works.
I think it's we're one of the most income equal countries in the world.
Yeah.
And I think, yeah, it definitely feels more relaxed, and the quality of life, I would say, is quite high.
Yeah.
But of course, some of these more developed Western nations may have some benefits to that as well. But I think we're striving. We're still a quite young country.
No, you are. And the educational system in Slovenia is excellent. We've always been able to hire extremely highly qualified people, but those people, if there are insufficient opportunities within Slovenia, will want to leave. But when they do so, they leave behind their culture, their language, their food, their customs. You can go somewhere else and get a good job and earn more money, but you're not in your own people. And I have said to people within the Slovenian government and trade organizations, I said, you ought to be crafting policies such that Slovenia exports its best products, not its best people. Because there's obviously a diaspora, and if you're a really smart young person and you invent something or you want to do something, you look around in Slovenia, there's insufficient opportunity, or there are institutional inhibitions against doing it. And I can relate to that because I left England in 1972 for pretty much the same reason. There was no future for me there. It was the system didn't encourage the kinds of things that I wanted to do. And so I think, I don't know whether this would be possible within the policy-making organizations of Slovenia, but you've got so many really smart people, they shouldn't have to go overseas in order to find a job.
Yeah, agreed. So,
now let's talk about the life of adventure.
Yes. With your business and your work, you've also gotten the chance to travel quite a bit. Can you tell us about some of those experiences?
Absolutely. I'll start out by saying that I made an unexpected choice to go into studying stuff in the atmosphere. I really hadn't planned it, I just wanted to stay in Berkeley. If instead I had joined a group that was studying water pollution, I would have spent the next 40 years looking at sewage and toilets. But atmospheric pollution gave us the opportunity to look at the atmosphere, which is everywhere. And one of the first applications of it was the Arctic, to ask the question, how did the black stuff get all the way up to the Arctic? Well, if black stuff can get up to the Arctic, it can go everywhere else. And once I started the business making the instruments, I realized the opportunity that there were many scientific groups or governmental organizations that were potentially interested in knowing what was going on in their remote atmosphere, but they didn't necessarily have the budget or the means to purchase an instrument. But if I would say to them, I'll give you the instrument if you'll take me there, then I had the opportunity of going to some pretty interesting places. So we had been on those airplane expeditions over the North Pole in the 80s. We had been to the Soviet Union and so on and so on. And in the middle 90s, I was talking to someone. I said, I've been to the North Pole. I'd really like to become bipolar and go to the South Pole. How would I do that? I said, I don't know any research groups that are doing this, or how could I attach myself to a project? Oh, said that person, because they knew, they said, it's easy. The Antarctic project management system has two camps, the science side and the operations side. When you submit a project, you submit it to the science side. If they approve it within their budget, then they give the whole packet of information to the operations side, and they take you wherever you've got to go. So I wrote a proposal to the National Science Foundation to measure black carbon at the South Pole for 3 years for $900. Normally a project like that would be $900,000. But I said, I'll donate the equipment. The $300 per year is simply for my incidental traveling expenses. Well, from their perspective, that was just a drop in the bucket. That was drobige. That was nothing. So the science side of the house approved it, boom, gave it to the operations side of the house that essentially said, send this idiot to the South Pole. And in 1996, on the basis of a proposal that I had written myself as an individual person in a one-person company operating out of a shed, I was on an airplane to the South Pole. And when I got there, I was so excited. It was the goal of a lifetime. This was the axis of rotation of the Earth. It was 45 degrees below zero. I was so excited I would have lost control of my bladder, excepting it would have frozen solid down my leg. I was 45 years old at the time. This was just unbelievable, an unbelievable adventure. And I took one of my instruments with me. We set it up there, and we measured an annual cycle of black carbon that was being transported to the South Pole all the way from up here, but that changed by 2 orders of magnitude, a factor of 100 to a factor of 1,000, from the austral summer to the austral winter. And so this was very valuable information from people studying global atmospheric circulation, because it was part of, more data for them to ask the question, how does the air get here? How does the air circulate? Where does the air go to? So this was the first example where I found that if I essentially took one of my instruments off of the production line, for the cost of the production and the materials, I could then offer it to somebody else if they would take me there. And they did.
And you've done multiple such trips, right?
And so that was one. Then, so that was the second pole, the South Pole. And then in 2016, we did the same thing to the third pole, which is Tibet and the Pamirs, because that's an area of the world that is covered with snow and ice that is affected by pollution. The ice cover and the altitude of Tibet has an influence on global circulation of the atmosphere that is similar to that of the 2 poles, and it's melting because it's downwind of India and China. So I contributed an instrument and got essentially a project that took us to the very furthest western part of China, where China has a border with Afghanistan that you wouldn't expect. And sure enough, you can measure black carbon everywhere. So now I've been to all 3 poles, and of course most people look puzzled and say, well, how does that work?
And so besides these poles, you've been to...
I've tried to go to cold places.
All right.
I don't do so well in hot places. We did a project off the north coast of Siberia in 1991, where spy satellites had shown a plume of what looked like smoke coming out of just one tiny island. Nowhere else. There were other tiny islands, just one tiny island every 2 or 3 weeks would show a long trailer of smoke. And Western scientists had only seen this from spy satellite pictures. Nobody knew what it was, but there were 3 possibilities. It was either a periodic volcano that erupted every 3 weeks, or it was a dumped Soviet warship with a nuclear reactor into which seawater was seeping, building up a pressure of steam, and then exploding like a natural geyser. Or, and this was the real climate driver, it was a bulge under the shallow seafloor of methane that was building up pressure and then releasing methane into the atmosphere, causing a cloud. And that was known to, it's known that there's a huge amount of methane frozen into the ice under the Arctic. And if this was true, then this could be a serious driver for climate change. So my colleague Russ Schnell made a whole bunch of completely fictitious phone calls, managed to assemble $50,000 by talking to 10 people and telling them that he needed $5,000 from each of them. And sure enough, I was on an airplane to Anchorage in Alaska, then to Nome in Alaska, which is just opposite the Soviet Union, and then on a plane across to Providenia with the equipment, and we were going to go study this Bennett Island plume. To finance the project, I had one bundle of $20,000, 1,000 $20 bills wrapped in aluminum foil, and unbeknownst to Russ, I had a second bundle of the same amount of money in the bottom of my luggage, because I realized that if we discovered something really dramatic, we were going to need extra airplane time. We got to the town of Chersky. I gave the money to the aviation manager. We had an old Russian airplane, and we flew out there, and there was nothing going on at all. So I had said to Russ, okay, you want me to fly in an antique Russian airplane into what is either a periodic volcano, steam coming out of a nuclear reactor, radioactive steam, or explosive methane. He said, yes, of course, you're exactly the guy. We got there and we flew round and round, nothing at all. The advantage was that because we were relatively close to Alaska, there was actually a phone line for the use of the native communities who shared relatives across the Bering Strait. And after a couple of weeks, I get an urgent phone call. Russ Schnell had seen the satellite picture. There was a plume of smoke. So we all went down to the airplane, got on the plane, and flew to Bennett Island. When we got there, there was nothing coming out of the ocean at all. It was just this little island surrounded by ice. But when we looked up, we saw clouds forming way above. And the reason was the island was unique in its shape of having an ice cap on it that looked like a ski jump slope. And when the wind blew from one direction, the air went up this ski jump. The air continued going up into the tropopause, and would trigger the nucleation of clouds at about 3,000 or 4,000 meters above the island. When the wind blew in this direction, this ski jump of ice was just right to make it go up and trigger a cloud, and then the cloud would trail away downwind. So it was purely a meteorological orographical feature. It had nothing to do with anything coming out of the ocean. But it was a great project.
Yeah. And this was one of the first, or was it the first post-Soviet Russian collaboration?
Yes, the Soviet Union had just collapsed. Nobody really knew what was going on. We made an amateur video of all of this, edited the video using a Commodore computer, made a VHS tape, and then shamelessly sent about 100 copies of that tape to all kinds of people in the US government who were trying to figure out how to work with what was happening in Russia. And Russ Schnell and I were invited to Washington, and we talked to Al Gore and Chernomyrdin and people like that. So that was just shameless self-promotion. But it was a great project anyway. Now, I got to admit, I hadn't said this earlier. When I came to Berkeley in 1972, there were many opportunities available to me in terms of what I could do. I was studying physics, but I thought that it might be useful if I learned Russian. So I went to the Slavic languages department almost immediately and said, I'd like to learn Russian. And they said, well, you're not a languages student. I said, I don't want to take it for credit, I just want to learn the language. So they said, well, you can come every day for an hour, so either at 8 o'clock in the morning, 9 o'clock. So I went every day, 5 days a week, 8 o'clock in the morning for an hour for 4 years. And after 4 years, I was pretty good at speaking Russian. Because of that, it actually had no benefit to me in terms of my formal physics. But then when I got into atmospheric science, people knew that here was a young man who spoke Russian. And when we did those projects over the Arctic, we then ended up, so the people at NOAA were going to go to Moscow to present the results and to talk with people. And they said, oh, young Hansen, he speaks Russian. So that helped, and that got me into those delegations. Nobody in Russia ever expected that an American would be able to understand their language, so they said all kinds of things that I could find out about afterwards. I don't smoke, but I very quickly learned that every time I went there, I would take several cartons of Marlboro with me, pass them out, and I learned that I could smoke, at least socially. But having an ability leads to potential possibilities. So the fact that I had learned Russian opened those various doors. I had no idea about it at the time. If I were going to do it now, I wouldn't learn Russian, I'd probably learn Chinese. But if you have an extra skill that's just in the background, you never know when it's going to come in useful.
You do speak a bit of Chinese, right?
对不起，我不说普通话, which means, excuse me, I don't speak Chinese.
Okay, we're gonna slowly close it off, though.
Okay.
I'm just wondering, do you want to share anything else with us? Do you have any closing remarks?
I would say, seize whatever opportunity is open to you. If somebody says to you, would you like to, ... the answer should always be, yes, of course. You know, when, how, where, what do I need to do? You never know which of those opportunities is going to eventually turn into something important. It's like standing on a bridge and you put a fishing line into the river to try and catch a fish. You don't know, and if you put in 10 different fishing lines, you might catch a fish with one of them. One of those fish might be the golden carp of Slavic stories. You just don't know. But what you do know is, if you don't put any fishing lines in the water, you will never catch a fish. When I was younger, I was always open for opportunities. Everything was always a yes rather than a no. Perhaps I inherited that from my mother, but taking those opportunities, potentially making mistakes, has never been a problem. I think now the world is much more open, much more connected. You can do anything, anywhere, but you still need to get off your butt and just do it.
All right, well said. This was fascinating, Tony. It's always a pleasure. Thank you very much for the conversation.
Thank you, Frank. It's been a pleasure meeting you, and you get to inherit my world.
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting time.
It is, yeah. And when I think of the changes for me, my mother was born in a house with no electricity. They had never seen anything in the air other than a bird until they saw the Kaiser's Zeppelins flying overhead. Everyone was terrified. Then there was the Great Economic Depression. Then there was the Second World War. There was Hitler, all of the bad stuff there. Then there was the Soviet Union, there was barbed wire from the Baltic to the Black Sea, there was nuclear destruction, and by the end of her life, she was sending email to me and I was at the South Pole. So the changes, the transformations, the opportunities in one's lifetime are astonishing. So you just got to go out there and grab it.
All right.
Good. Thank you very much. And you all, hang in there. There's lots more going on. We have not invented everything yet.
All right. Thank you, Tony.
Thank you, Frank.